Welcome to the Just Solutions podcast. I'm your host, Aiko Schaefer. In this episode, I sit down with Elena Krieger, Just Solutions Senior Director of Research and Policy, to talk about rising energy costs in our newly released report. You can find that report on our website and in our show notes. It's part of work that we're doing with states across the country that are leading the way. The report is titled Pathways for Action, Affording Our Clean Energy Future. It's always a pleasure for me to sit down with our staff on this podcast. Elena is a leading expert on this topic, and she has a PhD in Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering from Princeton University. She is such an impressive person and a great person to work with. Throughout the podcast, I try to address questions many people may have, such as why energy prices are rising, how federal cuts are making things worse, and what we can do about it. And while we discuss ways to provide immediate relief to people struggling, we do talk through a good range of solutions that drive the long-term goal of making clean energy affordable and accessible, and of course, reducing a major contributor to climate change. I hope you enjoy the show. So welcome, Elena, to the Just Solutions podcast.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
So as we head into the winter months and the federal actions take hold, what do we expect in terms of energy affordability? What kind of impact should we be prepared to see?
Yeah, so winter months are always hard, right? That is when people are increasing the amount of energy that they need to heat their homes in particular. It's particularly expensive for people who are using fuel oil and propane, but sort of across any of the colder climates, we see bills going up in the winter. There's a winter peak.
Are there other pressures that are going to contribute to increasing energy costs?
The important thing to remember when we talk about this is energy unaffordability is fundamentally a factor of people having persistently low incomes and increasing income inequality. And as long as that is true, people are going to struggle to pay for expensive things, right? Whether that's housing or energy. And again, as we see the disappearance of different kinds of safety nets and other things like that, those trade-offs and that general cost of living is going to increase, and it's going to get harder to pay for all kinds of different bills. If we had higher income levels across the board, energy might be expensive, but it wouldn't necessarily be unaffordable.
Very important distinction there. And so there's this pervasive unaffordability. The report that Just Solutions released that you authored talks about that. Unaffordability is not anything new. And part of what we were trying to do through the Inflation Reduction Act and other efforts at the state level is to be able to try to address affordability with clean energy alternatives. Then now we're in a compounding situation that you talked about, the compounding effects of cuts to food assistance programs, low-income heating energy assistance programs. And then on its own, if we remove all those things on its own, energy is becoming more expensive. So talk a little bit more about just that general trend. What's driving that trend towards energy being more expensive?
Yeah, so there are a lot of factors, I think, that are contributing to this, and they vary somewhat from state to state. I would think about the sort of drivers of unaffordable bills in two ways. And one are the persistent drivers that we've seen for decades, and the other ones are the emergent drivers that are making it worse now. People who are renters, who lack access to capital, often live in inefficient buildings. They can't get efficient appliances. They don't have a lot of information on their energy usage at all. And so without that kind of information, without that kind of control over the energy that you use or the money to reduce your bills sort of systemically through energy efficiency investments, those households are going to face sort of persistently high energy costs. And then on the utility side, we have utility costs and perverse incentives that have also been in place for a long time. So California, for example, just passed a bill to prohibit utilities from paying for their lobbying costs through rates charged to customers. But that is a common practice sort of across the board. And there are all sorts of costs that get bundled in there that fundamentally shouldn't be things that ratepayers are paying for when they're trying to pay for their electricity or for their gas. And there's a lack of sort of consistent transparency across the board from utilities to even know what they're spending money on. So it's hard to hold them accountable for what that spending looks like. Utilities tend to earn a rate of return on large gold-plated investments. These are, building poles and wires and large utility scale infrastructure. And because that's how they earn their money, it's a guaranteed rate of return that they're allowed to earn through the regulatory system. They have very little incentive to support, let's say, those whole household energy efficiency measures or community solar or distributed energy or other alternatives that might help people bring down bills and might make their energy more cost effective.
It is a very unusual dynamic that I think people may not understand, that there is no real incentive for utilities to reduce your cost and the way in which they use their money, which include, like you said, funding for lobbying, but also very, very high CEO salaries. It seems like a very frustrating dynamic that in many ways traps people in a situation that is really hard to get out of. And I think it's important, Elena, if you can help remind people, we're talking about utility energy affordability, but it's also tied to our climate goals. That is the other part of what we're trying to accomplish. We want it to be affordable, but we also are trying to drive clean energy. So what energy people use?
We have these persistent costs that have been problematic for a long time. And then we have increasing and emerging drivers that are driving up bills. And so what we've seen in the last 5 years is that on average, electricity rates have somewhat outpaced inflation. Gas rates have significantly outpaced inflation for methane gas delivered to people's homes, even though the actual price of gas itself went up after the war in Ukraine started and has come back down again. And yet gas delivered to people's houses has stayed persistently high. I think it's gone up something like 39% in the last 5 years. And while electricity has not necessarily increased quite as much across the board, in individual states it's gone up an incredible amount. So in California, electricity prices have gone up 60% in 5 years. That is due in large part to mitigating wildfires and paying for things like wildfire insurance. In other places, you're seeing individual impacts like your data center connections causing load growth and a lack of resources to meet that increased demand, forcing old and inexpensive power plants to stay online and to be paid expensive contracts to continue to operate. In Texas, the governor basically just asked everyone to not use as much electricity. There's actually demand response programs where you pay people not to do that. That's a real legitimate way to manage the grid. In Texas, they just did it informally, please everyone, just turn down your air conditioning a little bit because otherwise we're going to have blackouts. We're only going to see that kind of thing go up. There's ways to mitigate it. We can, again, do demand response programs, ask people to reduce their air conditioning load on the hottest days and pay them a little bit for that. That might be cheaper than paying an expensive peaker power plant to stay online. We can use air source heat pumps that are a lot more efficient and also can reduce your reliance on gas for heating in the winter. They can heat and they can cool as a way to bring down those summer peaks. But without sort of coordinated planning and incentives for that, we're starting to see this peak demand go up. And a lot of places are sort of feeling that crunch. In what's called the Grid Operator in the Mid-Atlantic, PJM, they're the sort of regional organization that manages grid flows across Virginia to Ohio and Pennsylvania. The capacity costs, the cost they pay to ensure that enough power plants are online when they need them, has reached record levels this summer. And that cost gets passed on to customers too. Wildfires are a problem in California, in Oregon, in Washington, both hardening the grid, paying for insurance. The other problem is that we have huge damage from hurricanes in the Southeast. And so we're seeing costs go up due to hardening the grid in the Southeast as well.
Well, and it's an interesting cycle that it feels like we're on, where when it's hot out, we all turn on our air conditioning more. And depending upon the source of energy, if it is a dirty source of energy, then that use of the air conditioner creates more pollution, which then drives climate change.
It drives climate change.
And so then you're back in the circle and then it causes the wildfires.
When a lot of those plants are disproportionately located in low-income communities and communities of color, they're contributing to pollution. They're all coming on hot days and making the air quality worse on these already hot days. The days when you'd want to fling your windows open and get some cool air, you're shutting them down because the air quality is bad and then you need that much more air conditioning, right? if you can afford it. Or you can't afford it and you're either exposed to the pollution or you're exposed to extreme heat. And that is a health risk.
Yeah, absolutely. And disproportionately in lower income Black and brown communities. And now more and more people, right? More people exposed to climate change, more people worried about paying their energy bills, more and more challenges this cycle that we're in.
Exactly.
Let's move a little bit to the solutions. Just Solutions published a report. We'll put it in the show notes. Elena has done some analysis of a state-by-state comparison of where energy prices are increasing, what states are increasing. But the report that we just published provides some very specific strategies. What's great about the work that you've done is that you've put them in different categories to help us kind of think about them in I think, a very logical construct. So can you just give us a broad overview of the areas and then we'll kind of dive in from there?
Yeah. So we broke down the broad strategies to address unaffordable energy in 4 categories. The first of those categories is protecting households. So in this bucket, we thought about things like bill assistance. This includes the federal LIHEAP that we discussed. Ways to help people pay for their bills when they're too high and they're unaffordable. Things like disconnection protections that ensure that households can not get shut off in winter months when they'd be exposed to extreme temperatures, during extreme heat in the summer, that people who have vulnerable health conditions still have access to electricity when they need it, as well as things like arrearage management plans and approaches to utility debt cancellation so people can dig themselves out of the hole if they fall behind on their bills. And these kinds of policies are urgent, right? These are the things that households need now in the face of rising bills, in the face of, unaffordable costs and increasing costs of living across the board in order to pay for their energy bills and avoid disconnections, avoid all of the repercussions and difficult trade-offs that come when they can't pay for energy. The problem with only focusing on this bucket, though, is it doesn't address any of the root causes of unaffordable energy. So we also included a set of strategies to try to systemically bring down energy costs. The first of these is focused on the residential sector. What are home decarbonization measures that you could do to try to decrease your bills? These are things like energy efficiency and weatherization programs, particularly with funding or financing for low-income households to be able to put in those air source heat pumps and swap out their old inefficient refrigerators and put in insulation and make sure that they can actually reduce their energy demand. So even if rates go up, they're insulated against those increasing and often volatile costs. This general bucket also includes things like community solar programs, low-income solar, access to local clean energy, solar and storage and microgrids, ways to build out home resilience, and distributed energy that can not only help people offset their utility bills, ensure that they have consistent access to clean energy through either low-income or community solar programs, but if you can build in things like storage, can actually build in resilience and have additional benefits in the face of a changing climate, in the face of potential grid outages, and particularly for some of your most vulnerable households. The next sort of big bucket of policies is focused on reining in utility costs. I think that we can actually break this down sort of into 3 different categories. One is largely utility cost containment. How do we make sure that utilities aren't passing those lobbying costs onto households, right? How do we make sure that rates are designed in an equitable and fair way so that residential customers aren't paying for the grid upgrades needed to connect new data centers? The second sort of component of that is utility accountability and transparency. These are data and reporting requirements, bill transparency requirements, metrics that require utilities to report affordability and disconnections and other things like that. And then set performance incentive mechanisms so they have to actually try to meet goals to improve affordability and disconnections and other reliability targets, resilience targets, whatever broader targets we think that the utility should be providing to all of its customers. They're a regulated monopoly. There is no competition here, and there has to be a set of transparency metrics and goals that they are held accountable to ensure that they're actually providing the broader set of services that we should all have the right to. And the sort of third part of utility reform that we're thinking about in the affordability context are measures to increase the clean energy transition and decrease our reliance on fossil fuels in a way that improves energy affordability too. So in a lot of places, there are wind and solar farms and batteries that are waiting for years to connect to the grid, to bring low-cost energy, to bring reliability online. And they're struggling with interconnection because there's delays in transmission queues. They're gas distribution companies trying to expand their gas distribution investments in new fossil fuel infrastructure that we know that we're going to have to move away from in the coming decades. And that's going to leave a whole bunch of what are called stranded assets, these investments that we put money into, and people are going to have to pay for decades after we are moved away from it. So there's this part of utility reform that I think really needs to be focused on trying to utilize clean energy, accelerate the adoption of clean energy, and reduce our reliance on volatile, expensive fossil fuel costs that are going to lead to, decades of stranded assets. And then the last category that we really focused on is novel funding and financing strategies, because all these things sound really great, and a lot of them cost a lot upfront. Energy efficiency measures pay for themselves in the long run, but they still cost money in the front end. You can pay for some of them through rates. We have a lot of programs where there are fees that put into your electricity rates or put into your gas rates to pay for additional energy efficiency measures or bill protections and other things like that. But fundamentally, if we want to achieve a rapid transition to clean energy and we want to ensure that there's enough funding and financing for all of these measures, well, we need our alternative mechanisms to pay for that. And there's a broad range of options. Some of these are novel polluter pays strategies, where fossil fuel companies are held accountable at the state level, at the city level, to pay fees that can be used for clean energy. Portland has a tax on revenue for large corporations that is going into the
Portland Clean Energy Fund.
Portland Clean Energy Fund. That goes into the Portland Clean Energy Fund. And the Portland Clean Energy Fund then can help pay for that transition, and that we see at the local level. So there are a range of strategies at all of these different levels that can potentially help find alternative sources and mechanisms for funding to pay those upfront costs or create green banks to finance those upfront costs so that we can help everybody, particularly those who don't have access to that money, ensure that they can transition to clean and affordable energy.
So it's interesting that you talk about the financing and funding part of this, Elena, because that is an important part of how we get these things done. Obviously, we had a lot of investments online coming to community through the Inflation Reduction Act. You also shared some great models around the Portland Clean Energy Fund and what's happening there.
Well, we did have funding through the Inflation Reduction Act, and a bunch of that's getting clawed back, right?
Exactly. And so as far as the funding, I think it's clear cities can do things, states can do things. None of us can make up for the federal cuts to LIHEAP for sure. And that is definitely something that we need to be looking at federally. But for our listeners who want to create change on this issue, is there a way to help us understand when you go through all of those solutions, who are the kind of prime actors? Like help us understand the jurisdiction of states versus the feds versus utilities, just those broad brushstrokes of who, if you want to create change, where should you be looking? Where's the point of decision-making and authority?
It's everywhere. I think that's actually one of the largest problems that we have is that the energy system is regulated in so many different places that it can get really opaque and really complicated. The utilities and the utility commissions, I think, are an important place to start. And so utility commissions set rates or approve utility spending. And it is possible for folks to get involved in utility commission proceedings and comment there. Those can be wonky. They can take a long time. Some places have intervener compensation where they will pay for non-utility actors to come in and participate in those proceedings, and some places don't. So you would also have to have funding to do that. So the other problem is that regulatory bodies like utility commissions can be hemmed in by policy in terms of what they are or aren't allowed to do. And so you can also go to state legislators who can direct utility commissions to open a new kind of proceeding to say that we have to set clean energy targets or distributed energy targets or help require that some of these goals are set if that's not something that seems possible through the immediate regulatory proceedings. You can also go to state legislators, and again, I think this can work with governors and things like that, to try to open up alternative sources of funding. So one of the challenges, as we said, is that you can't necessarily pay for every house to get energy efficiency upgrade through electricity rates. But we still think that that's important. And there are points where that gets even harder, right? What if you need to have a panel upgrade before you can electrify your stove or your heating system? What if you need to I have knob and tube wiring in my house that's probably from 1924, right? I can't even put insulation in my roof because our wiring's too old and it's going to be a fire hazard. We asked for a bid to replace our panel, that old knob and tube wiring, and put in an EV charger and make some other things so that we could sort of facilitate this transition. And the bid that we got was $50,000. That was just to enable us to upgrade in the first place, and not even to put in any of the actual clean appliances. How is anybody supposed to afford that, right? But that's not something that we can require to be put into electricity rates. That is something that potentially a state could open up something like a green bank, or could pull funding from taxes, or through some kind of cap and invest program, with all of the caveats and protections around cap and invest and potential pollution impacts from that, which we can maybe save for another discussion. There are ways at the state level that you can access these additional sources of funding that can help households pay for some of those costs in transition or finance some of those costs in transition. Then the next thing to think about sort of is the regional level. Again, we have these things like regional grid operators that are planning for transmission, that connect new energy resources, that ensure that there's enough capacity online to meet peak demand, and that transmission system regulation and oversight needs some improvements, I think, to put it lightly. There, again, are years of backup and delays to connect clean energy. There is very sort of little consideration of when you might be able to invest in distributed clean resources instead of investing in a huge transmission line. And so there's options to reform that regulatory decision-making to bring down costs and bring on clean energy in a way that brings some of these additional co-benefits too. And then at the federal level, we have all sorts of different kinds of regulations, everything from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that oversees actually all of those grid operators and regulates the electricity markets, or at least the interstate electricity markets, to the funding that was supposed to come from IRA, right? Things like solar for all, as well as tax credits, which unfortunately are all being rolled back, but were a way to help people afford some of those clean energy investments at their houses. That's something that maybe we could see at the state level. But again, people's state tax liability isn't necessarily as high. And tax credits also have one of the challenges that if people don't have a tax liability, then they can't necessarily get the tax credit. And it also doesn't come for a while. So you sort of have to sit there and wait for that money to come back to you. So if you don't have that funding, that additional amount of cash, it's not very accessible for low-income households. So there are ways that you can do sort of point of sale tax credits that can be applied. So there's a way that maybe states could take on those federal tax credits and improve them.
So my final question for you, Elena, is there are many of our listeners who are advocates who are out there organizing, and we can have immediate but likely more long-term impact. If people want to do something now, any recommendations in the near term for people who are really trying to help their neighbors around energy affordability and assistance?
I mean, I'm thinking of like people power solar and stuff like that. Like there's ways that there's like mutual aid that folks are trying to set up. I've seen that there's some, local organizations, I think, that are trying to set up community solar where everybody invests and can get a return on that.
Yeah. And I know some utilities, you can add a little bit more to your bill. I have no idea how impactful those are. Maybe it's in certain areas. At least when I was in Seattle, on your utility bill, there was a little line that said, do you want to contribute more to, this? So I think even if we don't have any solutions, right, with cuts to food assistance programs, we have a system, right? The food banks step in. Now, the food banks are supposed to be emergency food assistance. They've become a pillar of people's lives and survival, which is not the original idea, but nonetheless, there's a network there for people to share extra food through food banks. But it's interesting because on the utility side, which is also a basic need, you and I would argue, right? We don't have as much of a charitable pathway except for LIHEAP, which the staffing has been cut, support has been cut. But so we know that the LIHEAP program has never covered the need, and now it's under more pressure.
And a lot of states have already had bill assistance programs that are more extensive than something like LIHEAP. And so it is possible to pass bill assistance that Either you could do a percentage of income payment plan that caps the amount of somebody's bill to a fraction of their income to just make sure that it never exceeds, let's say, a threshold of 6%, right? I think the real emergency measure that we can see right now, I think Pennsylvania said they were going to do this, is put a disconnection moratorium while that bill assistance is not available, so that folks who were going to rely on that assistance don't get disconnected from their electricity because the government is shut down.
Yeah.
But
yeah, and we saw a lot of that during COVID.
Exactly.
Right. We saw a lot of emergency measures, and here we are again thinking about that. But it doesn't, as you've pointed out in our conversation, this is a pervasive problem. And
it just highlights once again that bill assistance isn't the solution, right? Bill assistance is fragile, and it is a stopgap measure that is critically important right now, and it's not going to fundamentally address any of these root causes. And so we can't lose that long-term goal and that long-term vision of reducing investment in fossil fuel infrastructure, bringing on affordable clean energy resources, and making sure that our lowest income households have access to them, and doing so in a consistent and systematic way. Otherwise, we're just going to keep seeing this again and again, and it's going to get worse. The climate gets worse. People are going to be exposed to more extreme weather and more extreme climate, and the lack of access to electricity is going to be an increasing health risk. So
that was a good ending point. Thanks, Elena, for being on our show today.
Thanks again. It was good to, I talk to you every day. Anyway. It's good.
That's an okay ending too.
It's good to be recorded with you. No. I'm glad that we can record something and really have a conversation about this, because this is increasingly and critically important.
Thanks to our listeners for joining us on the Just Solutions podcast. If you'd like to know more about our work at Just Solutions, visit our website at justsolutionscollective.org. Special thanks to our recording engineer and editor, Angel Bautista. If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts, and please share our show. If you really like what we're doing, please consider sponsoring the podcast. There's a link in the show notes to do that. Together, we're driving community-created, equity-centered solutions to address the climate crisis. I hope you'll join us for our next episode.